Hello world, this is Nabil. I am a graduate student at the University of
السلام
Arkansas
عليكم جميعا.
Fayetteville, and today I have with me Dr. Mohammed Dadawi, an assistant professor of political science at Oklahoma University. He is originally from Marrakesh, Morocco. He graduated from the University of Arkansas's King Fahd Center for Middle East and Islamic Studies with an MA in political science. He then set off to the University of Oklahoma, where he obtained his PhD in political science as well. His research interests span comparative politics, Middle East and North African politics, political violence, and international relations theory. Dr. Dadawi has a new book coming out in August of this year. It is called Moroccan Monarchy and Islamist Challenge, which addresses the Moroccan monarchy's ability to resist challenges to its legitimacy over the years. But today, Dr. Dadawi will talk to us about something different. He will discuss some of the different political and social aspects related to the death of Osama Bin Laden, the man believed to be responsible for the 9/11 attack. Hello, Dr. Dadawi. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
How are you today?
Good. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Okay, good.
So, our first question to you, Dr. Dadawi, is inspired from what I saw in Facebook as discussion from my friends and their friends. So, really the day that Osama bin Laden's death was announced, it seemed that all the Facebook posts were centered about this event. Not only that, but this matter actually stirred some really controversial ideas and discussions, and I find some of them really interesting and even surprising, yet
hmm
potentially confusing to some people. So, for example, I see Christian friends feeling sad to see people celebrating death, and I see some Muslims saying hateful things about the man, even though we know that in the teachings of Islam, it's we people should not hate and celebrate death.
hmm
Some, of course, seem to be saddened or angry to hear about his death, as they believed he spoke up for the oppressed people in the Middle East that suffer from some of the US policies that they found intrusive, unjust, or disrespectful. So, Dr. Dadawi, how do you explain this difference in the mindset of people and the manifestation of factions within the same religious groups?
Yeah. Well, I think because I think those differences are natural at this point, and maybe they are more psychological responses and reaction to the death of someone who has long been a symbol of this radical militant Islamist ideology. It is, of course, expected that a lot of the reaction will be as diverse as the Muslim world is. I think my guess would be that the majority of Muslims are probably feel a little bit of relief. I don't think the Muslims in general, and it's really difficult to quantify this. I mean, we don't have any survey data and so on and so forth that would probably confirm this, what I'm trying to say. But I think the majority probably feel relief because for a long period of time after September 11, Islam has been defined in terms of negative aspects and in terms of what it's not, what Islam is not, as opposed to what Islam is. So, for example, all we see from the newscasts and so on and so forth about Islam is just really about violence, about militant ideologies. It's about the killing and so on and so forth, which is again carried out in a larger scheme of things by the fringe, the minority of Muslims. But again, of course, that is the stories or the news that's going to make most of the headlines for obvious reasons. And within Islam itself, I mean, within the Muslim world, and it's really difficult to know. I think there is again this idea that we shouldn't celebrate the death of anybody, no matter how violent and evil they were, and so on and so on and so forth. But I think a lot of these reactions against Bin Laden emanate from that sense of relief because people, I think, especially people that lived in the West, they know the tremendous impact and tremendous disservice that Bin Laden did to the religion itself and to the Muslims around the world. But again, all of that, I mean, having said that, there are always those that are the minority, and I would call them the fringe, that are saddened by the death of Bin Laden, and some of them, of course, that are, wanting groups to retaliate and engage in the more violence, as if like violence should beget violence and so on. And I don't think that's also not Muslim, to kind of identify the religion in terms of this paradigm of vindication, of revenge. That is something also that is anti-Islamic. Not only is it un-Islamic, but it's anti-Islamic as well. But as I said, I think these are again, of course, natural, normal reaction, because we've had about 11 years of elevating somebody or having somebody associated with something that is, of course, in a sense, not good for Islam, and violence, and it's an idea or ideology that emptied Islam of its spirituality and rendered it into kind of a political ideology, just to, in a sense, conquer the world and so on and so forth through the use of violence. And of course, and that is also not Islamic and anti-Islamic.
All right. So, if if Bin Laden was actually the man behind the attack, which most of us believe, do you think he deserved what happened to him, or does he at least have the right of a hearing in court like any other criminal? People only
Yeah,
know one side of the story, and it is also their right to hear some of the clarifications,
yeah,
or also about his ideology that may have never reached the American ears. On the other hand, if he really deserves this, then what can you tell the people who are actually celebrating this, Muslims and non-Muslims? I know that Tariq Ramadan, a great professor and researcher in the domain from Oxford
hmm
University, who I believe is a good acquaintance to you, explicitly
hmm
said that he is against rejoicing about death, and it is unjust to condemn a man without hearing him in court, regardless of what he has done, and that is true justice. And
yeah. Well,
ironically, yes, okay, go ahead.
no, go ahead. I'm sorry, I need to cut
I
you off.
was just going to say that ironically, he also said that he would like to hear George Bush in court giving an explanation about the civilians' death in Iraq, but that's a different subject.
hmm Well, I think anytime I'm a Democrat at heart, and I believe in the rule of law. So anytime, of course, you have the opportunity to catch a mass murderer such as Bin Laden, of course, and bring him to justice, of course, I think you have to do that. I think countries, democratic countries, in which, of course, there is a supremacy of the laws, have to behave in ways that are different than how terrorist groups would behave. And again, we should not hold our countries, of course, hostage to the same standards and principles that are, again, perpetrated by these groups. Now, we don't know. There's obviously, and you're right, there's a lot that we don't know about, how the raid went and what transpired. Of course, we can always, uh, you know, you know, engage in these guesses and so on and so forth. But again, I think if maybe the United States had a chance to bring him alive, I think they would. I mean, from what the official turn of event, of course, initially we said he was armed, and of course we said he's not armed, but he resisted and so on and so forth. So I mean, we don't know what transpired, what happened. Now, if there was an opportunity to bring him alive, I think I would be in favor of bringing somebody like that to justice and have him account uh, for his uh, for his crimes. But from what we know about Osama bin Laden, what he said in the past, he's not interested in being captured alive, and that he would prefer, quote unquote, that martyrdom than being captured, alive. And again, and we also that if he captured alive, that would turn into a mass circus, for the media and so on and so forth. I mean, I don't want to, say, that of course he's deserved and so on and so on, but but he did, he was responsible for killing of thousands and thousands of people. Um, Again, of course, I mean, it's not something that I would lose sleep over, that he's not brought to justice, but I would have had the same inclination as you do, which is, of course, have this preference for bringing him to justice. But I just don't think that the U.S. forces or the SEALs had a chance to bring him alive. Otherwise, they would have done it.
Uh, imagine Osama bin Laden in court, sitting down, being asked questions. Now, given that he is a
Yeah.
smart tactician and very knowledgeable about his religion, Islam. Okay, so from one hand, you have his full awareness about what the teaching of Islam are, and then on the other hand, he is not a crazy person. He is a smart tactician who is able to plan things, and he showed kind of shrewdness when he speaks. So, what do you think he would say?
Well, I don't. I mean, all these hypothetical questions is really difficult. I don't think that the man would have shown any remorse to begin with. I think he would probably, engage in his same tirades against the United States. I mean, the man was obsessed with the United States, and whether that is good or bad and so on and so forth. I mean, we can always discuss U.S. foreign policy. That's very legitimate, but we cannot let that blind us, of course, the means and the tactics, as you said, that he used in order to voice out that grievance, which is again, the engaging in, this matter, mass murder. But I don't think, the man would have been remorseful. I don't think he would have any, retractions and so on and so forth. I don't think he would deny, these acts or anything. I think, for anybody who's probably will be relegated into I would say, the ash heap of history. I mean, they would not go down without a fight, so to speak. And it probably that's how we wanted to be remembered. Somebody who was, killed fighting, whatever that cause, kind of perverted cause that he had. So I don't know what he would say. I'm maybe even surprised to, that he would say something else, but I doubt it. I think the man would probably stuck to his guns until the last minute, until he's probably put in jail or, put to death.
Now, do you think that after his death, do you think that his holy war against the United States will continue, or do you think that the attacks will probably persist?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, we know one thing, that whether he's alive or dead, this terrorism and this militant Islamist variant of it, it's still alive. I think it would be quite unwise to state that the war on terrorism should end, because terrorism is a tactic, it's not an ideology. And terrorism will always be with us, as a human, kind. But Al Qaeda itself, while the symbol of Al Qaeda is dead, and the leader of the Al Qaeda is dead, Al Qaedaism is still alive as an ideology that is committed to fighting what they perceive is this unjust, imperialist or neo-imperialist power of the United States and its allies and so on and so forth, fighting to establish or re-establish the Islamic, caliphate and so on. All of that will still continue. Al-Qaeda is, as I said, is defunct now, I would say, and for a long period of time, I think Osama bin Laden has been, did not have full control over the operations of Al-Qaeda itself, because it was on the run and so on. But what we have right now is that Al-Qaeda has had a number of subsidiaries and affiliates around the world and in parts of the world. There's Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. There's Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Hakim, which is, and these both are still, active, branches of Al-Qaeda that are committed to committed to the same vision as Osama bin Laden, had. So again, we're not going to see an end for this war, this, against, terrorism, or we're not going to see an end for terrorism against, states, United States, Western countries, or even Muslim countries. As I'm sure you know, is that 2 weeks ago on April 28th, there was a bombing in Morocco, in Marrakesh. But again, at the same time, of course, while that was not by Akim, Al Qaeda in the Maghreb, because they came out and denied involvement in it. But what we have right now is that the ideology still lives. These people that act on this, allegedly speaking, they were inspired by this jihadist, quote unquote, militant jihadist, um, ideology and thought. So they were inspired by that. They wanted to prove their worth, let's say, to Al Qaeda and to this to these terrorist groups. And that's the risk, and it's really hard to combat. I mean, and you're not going to do it through launching wars on countries, of course. I mean, if anything shows us, the death of Osama bin Laden is that I think it shows us the success of the counter-terrorism, war against, terrorism. That if you want to combat terrorism, you have to engage in small-scale, long-term intelligence gathering and counterterrorism strategies that are not so much deploying troops and waging, these conventional type of wars or guerrilla warfare in order to eradicate, these societies and countries, out of, terrorism. And just, today we had, couple bombings, so yesterday in Pakistan, not that far from where Osama bin Laden, lived, in Abbottabad. So again, it was, claimed by Pakistani Taliban because of the death of Bin Laden. So it's an act of revenge. So yes, I mean, war on terrorism will be with us, and the terrorism itself will be with us as well, unfortunately.
Well, this brings us to our next question or our next point. So before I ask you this question, let me just tell you, during after the event of Osama's death, I was reading this quote in Facebook. It says, "I mourn the loss of thousands of precious lives, but I will not rejoice in the death of one, not even an enemy.
Yeah.
Returning hate for hate multiplies hate, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that." Now, according to you, Dr. Dad, should should we consider another strategy as for how can I say how to conquer hate with love, how to conquer our enemies with love, or small scale intel as you described is the only way to go? What about the US or the whole world actually changing their foreign policy and try to combat hate with love, try to win the heart of the oppressed people? Because actually some of the people think that the causes of political and economical unrest, as well as the 9/11 attacks, are from the oppression and injustice caused by some of the foreign policies. Some of the intrusiveness, some of the violence, and then when you send troops to Iraq, even if the goal is noble, but you're going to have uh, collateral damage, and that will anger a lot of people. So what
Yeah.
about as the Islam teaches, as as also we've had the Dalai Lama like this week at the University of Arkansas, and he also spoke and he continues to speak about how to conquer the enemy with love is very important. So what about taking this side and trying to reach out to the people and try to extinguish the fire of terrorism with love? What do you think about this?
Well, I think that's why noble. It's highly idealistic because we're talking here about a phenomenon within international relations, and international relations, unfortunately, and I'm with you that nonviolence conquers all. No matter what your grievances are, I think you lose any legitimate recourse or resort to anything, well, when you use violence, especially violence in mass scale, like what happened on September 11th. And I don't, we all, of course, know about U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and so on and so forth. And we have to also blame, our own governments supporting these undemocratic, corrupt countries and so on. Again, United States foreign policy in terms of the moral relativism, the double standard, all of that, of course, are causes for the anti-American sentiment in parts of the world, not just the Middle East. But in international relations and the conduct of international relations, of course, it is again a realpolitik. It's all about balance of power and so on and so forth. It's about it was strategic and geopolitical, gain and interest. What happens, of course, when you deal with the threat of insecurity, a lack of order in your societies, I think, the government also has to show a little bit of commitment to fighting, that violence. And oftentimes, when you have to fight violence, you have to use violence in order to pacify society itself. Now, terrorism itself as a tactic, I think one way you can fight it and of course, more effectively, I would say, is through getting at the sources, at the roots of it. And again, and you're right, some of the sources are that U.S. foreign policy. It's the double standard. And I think the United States behooves the United States. And I think, there is an understanding with the United States right now, foreign policy. And for foreign policy, it's really difficult and it doesn't change, rapidly. I mean, it takes a little bit of time to change, certain types of ways of thinking of foreign policy, formulations of foreign policy. But I think, we need in the United States to change how we approach the Middle East and the Muslim world. We need to be firm on key issues such as, of course, freedom. Okay, we need to be firm on these undemocratic, corrupt regimes that are ruling these countries, and especially right now with the Arab Spring in the Middle East. These are all good, positive signs of the increasing restlessness within the Arab society and in the Middle Eastern society. And of course, we support in the United States certain countries. We support, somewhat Tunisia, we support Libya and so on and so forth, but we're not supporting Bahrain. Bahrain is going through, the same thing, and the regime is repressing with all its force and all its might, these things. But again, the United States is not, showing any regard for that. Syria is the same thing. We're still, reluctant to fully condemn and pledge our support for the opposition and for the freedom movement. But again, nonviolence is always good. I mean, and it proved its success in the past, through the Gandhi in India and through Martin Luther King Jr. in the United States here with the civil rights movement. But I don't think it will be enough or sufficient to combat terrorism. I think you have to have certain concrete policy items and policy formulations and of course, law enforcement and counterterrorism measures in order to fight terrorism. Because I think, some of these groups are not interested in having any dialogue with these states. There's tremendous animosity and hatred towards these states and revulsion. So the only way that they know in order to actually voice out their grievances is through, wreaking, havoc through, political violence against innocent civilians, in an indiscriminate way. But I tend to be idealistic at sometimes too, but I know international relations, we just can't afford to be idealistic all the time. Lest we're gonna lose, our security and our sense of order, in these societies, not just in the United States, but around the world.
I heard a speaker about this topic say that promoting peace is very different from pacifism because it takes a great courage, a great effort, and a lot of bravery to achieve that goal. You have to speak up, constantly speak up and defend your ideals. And it's not just sitting back and then doing nothing. It's actually doing a lot. And promoting peace, it's not easy.
Yeah.
I think it's harder.
Yeah.
It's harder than investing
Yeah.
resources in counterattacks.
And I think, that's right. I mean, I think it's really more difficult to promote peace than actually
Exactly.
engage and wage wars. And that is different, you said, from being pacifist and because there's always this kind of pejorative connotation of being pacifist as being passive, not, proactive and so on. And always there's room for, changing the hearts and minds. I think in the United States, trying to do some of that. But these are all long-standing, policy formulations that will take some time to change. And I think, not just, of course, the United States foreign policy, but we also have to change, the sources of grievances inside our own societies. And a lot of that happens when you have lack of freedom, when you have corruption, when you have repression, when you have, paralysis economically and politically speaking, and, nepotism and kleptocratic types of systems. Again, the, there is not a lot of hope for people. And I think, when you are oppressing people for a long, long period of time, it's kind of like a volcano. Sooner or later, they will erupt. And that's what we're seeing right now in the Middle East. And I think this cause of, militant Islamism is probably passé now. I mean, it's something of the yesteryear. I think even before the death of Osama Bin Laden, and I think he probably saw that himself, and I think he would have thought that, his ideas were not as relevant and salient to a lot of people in the Middle East anymore. Because if you look at the Arab Spring today, I mean, this is again goes to the point that you bring about, peacefulness and promoting peace and so on and so forth, and non-violence. You look at the Arab Spring, none of the movements and the protests that we saw in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Syria, and so on and so forth, initially in Libya, were violent. The protest movement in Yemen today, in Bahrain, the protesters were always non-violent. They were peaceful. They have demands that looked more towards the West and Western ideals of democracy, rule of law, and so on and so forth, than looking at Bin Laden's, Qaedaism and, Islamic jihadist, type of ideology. So, I mean, we've seen a change, and I think, Bin Laden's death is only basically, I would consider it a death knell to this ideology. I mean, it will be a footnote in history, I would say, at some point. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to be complacent and we don't have to worry about it. Of course, it's a threat that lives with us, will live with us for a long period of time, because there you have people that are not committed to anything but wreaking havoc and destroying and destruction in the name of religion. So it's really difficult to reason and find a common ground to have some type of dialogue or discourse with these people. And that's difficult because the people themselves are not peaceful in nature. They strayed away from the true principles of Islam, a religion, as you know, religion of peace. But again, non-violence, and that's what we're learning right now. It's a great lesson going on right now in the Arab world. Non-violence has worked. Has toppled Tunisian dictator. It has toppled Mubarak, the Egyptian dictator. It's causing a major problems. Syrian dictator as well, and the Yemeni dictator, and so on and so forth. So non-violence works because when you go towards non-violence, when you resort to non-violence and peacefulness, then you take the ability of the regime and the state to repress you in the name of order and security, because you're not threatening order and security if you're non-violent.
Nicely put, Dr. Dadawi. Nicely put. And
Thank you.
we end our interview today by with this discussion, and thank you, Dr. Muhammad Dadawi, for your precious time. We certainly appreciate you sharing with us your knowledge and thoughts about this current event, as well as the ongoing related matters. And we wish you a good continuation in the great research efforts you are performing, and we look forward to hearing from you in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Thank you.